Good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's lecture sponsored by the Center for American Studies and Research. My name is Patrick McGreevy, and we're very fortunate to have with us today Ali Abunimah. Ali Abunimah is the author of One Country, a Bold Proposal to End the Israeli-Palestinian Impasse. He has degrees from Princeton and the University of Chicago. He is a journalist and a commenter on public affairs in print, on radio, on television, and most importantly on the internet through Electronic Intifada.net. If you have been going to electronicintifada.net, it would have been no surprise to you that there was something called a Gaza bombshell, because this was very well reported last July. And so he's one of the people who is providing another point of view to people all over the world, and particularly to people in the United States, that they're not going to get on CNN and CBS and NBC. He also, during the 2006 Lebanon War, Electronic Intifada started something called Electronic Lebanon, which updated people about the situation in Lebanon. The title of his talk today is After Bush, Will U.S. Policy Towards the Middle East Change? Please welcome Ali Abunimah.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. I want to thank the Center for American Studies and Research, and particularly Patrick McGreevy, for extending the invitation, I think, more than a year ago, or even a year and a half ago, and I kept delaying it until we could find a time. And so I really thank you for your patience and bearing with me. And it's a particular honor to be here at AUB. I heard about it all my life. My father is a graduate of AUB from, I think, a class of 1959 or 60. I should know, but I think it's definitely in there. And so what I want to... And I want to thank you for that kind introduction, and also point out that both Electronic Intifada and Electronic Lebanon are the work of many people, and we were very fortunate during the war in Lebanon that many people here in Lebanon contributed articles that and told stories about what was being done in Lebanon that were not being told in the United States, and that's something that we've tried to do all along. So I want to make sure we have as much time for discussion as possible, partly because I've been talking a lot the past couple of days, so I want to have an excuse to let you talk, and because I think that we live at a time when there's so much uncertainty and worry about where things are going. So I thought I'd start by looking, the title is After Bush, so before we move to the after, maybe start with a little review of where we are and how we got here, and then move to some baseless speculation about what might come next. So I looked at some of the surveys that have come from the Pew Research Center. They have a very useful global attitude survey. They look at a number of issues. It's a very good resource. And currently just 30% of Americans approve of President Bush's stewardship of foreign policy. So numbers which are not that dissimilar from what you might find in this part of the world. There's a lot of opposition to that foreign policy. There is a rising huge amount of dissatisfaction with the war in Iraq. Now, over 50% of Americans consistently say that the invasion of Iraq was a mistake. And this is giving rise to a growing isolationist sentiment. So now about 2/5 of Americans say the United States should mind its own business. And that also is a sentiment that I think many people in the region share. So there may at last be a basis for common understanding between these regions and peoples. But Americans also, I think, have some views that would be sharply at odds with most people in the region. In the summer of 2006, when Lebanon was under bombardment and its civilian population and infrastructure were being deliberately targeted by a U.S. client state, Israel, a majority of Americans felt that the United States was not responsible for resolving the conflict between Hezbollah and Israel. And very few Americans would have been aware of, even conscious of the U.S. role that in sustaining it and actually preventing an end to it. Some other examples of views that are worrying, I think, in terms of support for torture of suspected terrorists, what the researchers call suspected terrorists. Just about half of Americans believe that it is often or sometimes okay to torture people, and the other half believe that it is rarely or never okay to torture people, which means that for a U.S. politician now, to speak out against torture is a courageous position politically, and that's a measure of where things stand. 52% of Americans think that the U.S. policies towards the detainees in Guantanamo, these are people who were kidnapped from Afghanistan and other parts of the world by the United States and are being held incommunicado, that 52% of Americans think that their treatment is fair, and only 33% think that it's unfair. So that's just some examples, and I'll talk more about how foreign policy is being discussed in the United States in a few minutes. But when you look now at views of the U.S., how do people in this part of the world look at the United States? They did some research in actually over 50 countries, but I looked at just the ones in this region. And the question here is, do you have a favorable or unfavorable view of the United States? And there's some interesting patterns that emerge. The countries with the most unfavorable view of the United States, of the general public, were Jordan and Egypt. Both 78% of people have an unfavorable view of the United States. The Palestinian territories, 86%, and Turkey, 83%. And in all of those countries, the number of people having a favorable view of the United States is in the low teens. In Lebanon, 47% have a favorable view and 52% have an unfavorable view. So it's split about 50-50. In Kuwait, it's also split about 50-50. And in Israel, about 80% have a favorable view of the United States and about 20% have an unfavorable view. And that, I don't know if it's a coincidence, we can't tell from the poll, but that's just about the proportion of Israeli Jews to Palestinians within the State of Israel. It would be good to see if that holds up. And the other finding is that views of the United States have declined since 2002, except in Lebanon, where the U.S. image has improved slightly. And there's a lot in these polls, so that, any students who are doing research or have papers to write might want to look at them. But some examples of things that struck me was that U.S. policies are now widely viewed all over the world as increasing the gap between rich and poor. And around the world there is a broad and deepening, that's the term that the researchers used, a broad and deepening dislike of U.S. values and a global backlash against the spread of American customs and ideas. And when asked about American ideas of about democracy, it's very interesting that a few years ago, views of American democracy were very, very popular, were very high in the region. Now, the countries where American ideas about democracy are disliked the most are Turkey, 81% of the population, France, 76%, Pakistan, 72%, and the Palestinian territories, 71%. So the two things that struck me there, and again, this is something that students might want to go and look at more closely, is the countries where the governments get the most support from the United States are the countries where the people dislike the United States the most. Except Lebanon, where you might say it's a special case. And then when you look at the countries that dislike U.S. ideas about democracy the most, you look at Turkey, Pakistan, and the Palestinian territories. It's hard to draw conclusions, but Professor McGreevy mentioned in the beginning the Gaza bombshell. That's a reference to the coup d'etat that the United States organized against the democratically elected Hamas government in the occupied territories last summer. And it really was we're always accused in this part of the world of believing in conspiracy theories. Well, this wasn't a conspiracy theory, it's a conspiracy fact. And it was, for those who haven't read the history, there was an election. The U.S. didn't like the result, so they armed and trained militias to overthrow the elected government, following exactly the model that was used in Central America for many years in the 1980s. And so it may be no surprise that Palestinians aren't very impressed by American ideas of democracy. Turkey, which is a close ally of the United States, interestingly, on every measure, in Turkey, the people were the most unhappy and the most hostile to the United States, on absolutely every measure. And I don't know if it is coincidental that there as well we see the Western countries at least being silent as a popularly elected government is consistently squeezed, supposedly for being Islamist, and I'll say more about that too. But it's reached the point where the Supreme Court in Turkey is actually going to try to make, or is going to hear a case to make the government elected by an overwhelming majority of the people illegal, and to ban all of the elected leaders from politics for 5 years. And this was a case where the European Union said, we will have to study that and see what impact that will have. In other words, they were very cool about it. They couldn't come out and say, yes, this is fine, but we can imagine in a different scenario where they'd think this is absolutely ridiculous. You're going to get a bunch of unelected judges to outlaw a governing party that's freely elected. So those are some of the findings that I think form the background to this. Again, just a quick review. Since 9/11, U.S. policy has been conducted under an official slogan and an unofficial slogan. The official slogan is the war on terror. The unofficial slogan is the clash of civilizations, or even what many people in the region perceive to be a war against Islam, because that it seems to be, in the perception of many people, that is the problem. Some of the symptoms, or some of the effects we've seen of the so-called war on terror is most obviously the invasion of Iraq and the invasion of Afghanistan. Nobody yet has a good explanation for why Iraq was invaded and occupied. Both of these wars are going badly. I'm not going to focus on them now, but I'll be very happy if we talk about that more in the question of answers. But both of them are being very actively framed by American politicians, not just by President Bush, but now by all the major candidates, as being part of this war against radical Islam. And that's what they use on the campaign trail. They say we're engaged in a war against radical Islam. And their definition of radical Islam includes absolutely everything and anything that they don't like. So it very explicitly includes all forms of resistance to military occupation, to Israeli aggression, to American occupation in Iraq. If you resist it, you're a radical Islamist. It doesn't matter, how you resist it. It's all placed under that rubric. And we see this particularly with the relabeling of local conflicts as being part of this overall war on terror or war against radical Islam. So Lebanon has very complicated politics which go back to the time of the French Mandate and what happened after that. It seems to me that the only solution for Lebanon's political problems is for compromise and agreement among all Lebanese about how they want to live together and under what sort of arrangements. It doesn't seem to me that Lebanese politics work very well if half the population or a greater part than that is labeled as simply being terrorists and radical Islamists and you can't talk to them, and the other half are called something else. It doesn't seem that that is a strategy that can benefit any Lebanese, and yet that is how Lebanon is talked about in the United States, when it's talked about at all, which is very rarely. And it doesn't seem to me that it makes much sense to talk about the war, the conflict in Palestine as being one about religion or one about civilizations. It makes much more sense to talk about it as a conflict over land, resources, political rights that can be resolved by taking from those who have too much and sharing it with those who have too little. And that's how conflicts are usually resolved. It's how South Africa was resolved, Northern Ireland was resolved, and it's how Palestine can be resolved. But to put it in the framework of a war of civilizations guarantees an endless conflict. And yet all of these conflicts are placed in the same category. So we see in Lebanon, Iraq, Palestine, Afghanistan, other countries, the United States picking sides very explicitly. And the language they use is very simple. They talk about the good guys and the bad guys. There's nothing in between. You're either good guys or bad guys. And that seems to me, it doesn't work for people in this region, and it's something that we ought to look for an alternative to. We've also seen, as part of U.S. policy, the explicit encouragement and incitement of sectarian sentiment, which again is a very dangerous and divisive and counterproductive policy. This is talked about openly in the United States media, among the people who work in the think tanks which provide the ideological justifications for U.S. policy, where they say very explicitly, we are going to support this sect against that sect, where there was the invention of something called the Shiite crescent to make people afraid, and which fits into a framework really of growing incitement against Iran. And I call it that because there is in the United States a 24-hour campaign from politicians, from cable television stations and in the media to do to Iran what was done to Iraq, to argue that Iraq, as was done with Iraq, Iraq is such a threat that if we wait for proof that it's a threat, the proof will come in the form of mushroom clouds. The same propaganda campaign is now in full swing against Iran. And it doesn't help, it doesn't make any difference when you point out that Iran doesn't have aircraft carriers in the Gulf of Mexico, it doesn't have warplanes flying over New York or Chicago or Los Angeles, that Iran doesn't have the ability to project power or threaten the United States in any real way, and that on the other hand, Iran is a country that where the countries on the left and the right are occupied by the United States, where you have U.S. fleets off its coast, where almost every day we have U.S. politicians talking about how they would like to bomb Iran. And this has become a test of your macho strength, is how far you're willing to go to bomb Iran. And this all happens in a context of sound bites, no real information, no real research, no real understanding of what's going on in the region, and above all, no willingness at all for dialogue. And that's really the most disturbing thing, because there's two trends that have been going on since 9/11. One is the consistent dehumanization and denigration of Muslims and Arabs, which is necessary, which is a necessary part of the policy, because to maintain an overall U.S. strategy of controlling the region or managing its affairs, as the United States has been trying to do, that requires, as we have seen, a great deal of violence. And to sustain the levels of violence that it requires, you need to dehumanize the subjects of that violence. If the American public sympathized with people in the region to any great extent, they might be disturbed by the amount of violence that is being carried out and that is now almost never seen. It's very rare, actually, to see much reporting about what is happening in Iraq. When I watch the evening news, you'll be lucky if there's a 30-second clip of the latest car bombing in Baghdad, where they say, and suspected Sunnis carried out a massacre of Shiites. Nobody knows what Sunni is, what Shiite is. But the point is, it's portrayed as being entirely nothing to do with the United States. We're just, look at these people killing each other, and we are troubling ourselves to help them, and the reward we get for that is that they shoot at us as well. But so on the one hand, you have the consistent dehumanization of Muslims, and I'm going to talk about how that plays out in the election campaign in a minute. And on the other hand, a total unwillingness to listen. Because if there was a dialogue with Hezbollah, for example, or Hamas, for example, both of which are groups that have put forward ideas of how they want to see their countries and the region managed, which differ from those of the United States, but are not blind to or closed to any compromise. They're people generally who are willing to talk and willing to be flexible and willing to see things done in a different way. But if you don't talk to them, on the one hand, you've dehumanized them and the people they represent. On the other hand, you repeat constantly, as we hear in the United States, you can't talk to them. They're too radical. They don't. All they want to do is kill Americans and kill Jews. How can you talk to people who don't, who that's all they want to do? So this is, again, a strategy that is designed to prevent us from asking questions or talking to people with whom we disagree. The other elements, and I'll go through these quickly, are consistent support for Israel and the shedding of any pretense of the U.S. playing a balancing or an honest broker role. I might say more about that later, I'll just mention it now. And the growing support for regimes that increasingly lack legitimacy and lack the ability to represent their people, provide them with basic services, or to give them any sense of belonging and citizenship. And we see this interesting phenomenon, we were talking about it earlier today, that in regions, in countries across the region and beyond, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Pakistan, Libya, Yemen, all of these have something in common. They're all nominally republics. And yet all of them are slowly turning into unofficial monarchies, where the son of the Za'im or the son of the president is being groomed to take over, or, you know, in the case of Pakistan, the son of Benazir Bhutto, in Lebanon, the son of Rafiq Hariri, in Egypt, the son of Mubarak, in Syria, the son of Hafiz al-Assad. In Yemen now, I only noticed the other day that the son of President Ali Abdullah Saleh was making official visits to Arab countries. I thought, oh no, another one. The son of Gaddafi has been playing this role for a while. And this shows the lack of legitimacy of these regimes and their total lack of any ability to reproduce leadership in a legitimate way. And people accept this to some extent. They know it's wrong, but they accept it because they say, well, what else is there? At least it's a system. At least we know that power will pass, because this man won't live forever, that power will pass to someone. So I think it's a measure of how lacking in legitimacy these regimes have become. And on the other hand, we see the growth of movements like Hamas in Palestine and Hezbollah in Lebanon that have been able to a large extent to mobilize the grassroots, to represent the aspirations of certainly not all the people, but a significant segment of the population in these countries, and have been able to answer to the needs of people that they have been crying out for. Particularly, this is all happening in the context of military occupation and resistance, but also the need for basic social services, health services, and community services that are not being provided to large segments of the population. And you see this phenomenon throughout the region. It's very striking that I came from Amman and I see it in Lebanon, of the luxury developments everywhere, the luxury gated communities everywhere, on every piece of land. And that's fine. So people who want to buy luxury apartments will be able to. I'm not against that. But who is building houses and schools and clinics and roads and playgrounds for everyone else? You don't see that going. The need is enormous because the population is enormous. We should be seeing on every corner, we should be seeing new schools, new clinics, new hospitals. We don't. All we see is luxury developments with luxury names. And that is a very dangerous trend. And that, it seems to me, it makes even less sense than to shut out and delegitimize and demonize the movements that are actually answering to the populations that have been left out of any of this economic wealth. So that's my very quick and very objective overview of the situation. It's okay. You can object to any part of it, and I certainly welcome that. It's very interesting that only two. I mean, the striking thing is that there has been no real debate about foreign policy. There has, you could almost say, well, there's been no real debate about anything, and that's almost true. That's almost true. But I would say there has been more debate about health care. You have been able to read in the newspaper fairly well thought out articles looking at the pros and cons of different approaches to health care. And health care is a big problem, of course, because 50 million Americans or more don't have health insurance. The United States doesn't provide health insurance as a right to its citizens. And there might be other issues where there's been some debate. But on foreign policy, there was a debate about whether Hillary Clinton's visits to Bosnia and Northern Ireland qualified as foreign policy experience, and about whether Barack Obama's time as a child in Indonesia gave him any insight into foreign policy. The only issue that has been discussed is Iraq, and there everyone has agreed not to really make it an issue, just to kind of paper it over and push it aside. Israel was mentioned once in one of the televised debates, and there it was for everyone to compete with the other to show what a strong supporter of Israel they are. I'll say more about that too. And so really there has been no public debate about foreign policy. At the same time, you have the constant fear-mongering. If you turn on the television, there is constant fear-mongering about... the other day I watched the local news in Chicago, and this was, probably a report that was shown around the country about how security experts, they didn't name who they are, where they came from, or what they, what this was based on, would now use women disguised as pregnant women to carry out suicide bombings in American shopping malls. So the idea now was that the fear would be so widespread that you couldn't even look at a pregnant woman without worrying that she might explode in the shopping mall. And that's an example of the kind of, you might think I'm exaggerating, but if you watch the television, it is constant conspiracy theories, fear-mongering, and sort of incitement against this part of the world in general, and Muslims and Arabs in particular. The fact that we have in the United States every week a school shooting, sometimes every day, but the television only reports the ones where white students are killed. If black children are shot at school, it's not reported. In Chicago, in 2008, so far, 18 children have been shot dead in their schools. But because they're mostly black children, nobody knows about that. So we have problems of terrorism in the United States. We've had 3 mass shootings in the Chicago area, 2 mass shootings in the Chicago area in the past couple of weeks. One of them you probably heard about, at Northeastern Illinois University, and one was at a shopping mall in the southern suburbs, in a Lane Bryant clothing store where 6 people were killed. So we have terrorism, we have crime. There are things to be afraid about, but these are not the things that are being talked about. No one is talking about, the other day I took a picture of it, I put it on my photo blog. I went into Walmart, the big shopping store, and they had a sale on ammunition. And you can take it off the shelf, put it in your shopping cart, and go through the checkout. The only thing it says, you have to be over 18. So so it was boxes of 9mm bullets where it was 20% free. I mean, it's so. This is to a great extent a society where violence is very much accepted and part of the norm, and not talked about in the way that it is talked about when it appears elsewhere in the world. What we've seen in the past 8 years, you may have heard of the Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz. He and his colleagues did a very comprehensive study. It's now been published in a book called The $3 Trillion War, which estimates that the accumulated cost of the war in Iraq will reach $3 trillion. To put that in perspective, the U.S. economy is about $14 trillion, $14,000 billion. So $3 trillion is a huge chunk. I think the economy of the UK is $2 trillion. So to give you a sense of the scale of this. And this you can already see, without really doing much digging, the effect of this on the United States internally. The United States is still far ahead of the world in many fields. Its universities are still the best in the world. Its industry and productivity are still very high. But there is an enormous lack of investment. When you are diverting that amount of resources to unproductive things and destructive things like wars, or like paying pensions and health care for disabled veterans for the next 50 or 60 years, you're not going to have resources to invest in education, in health care, in infrastructure. I heard a lot of people in Lebanon in the past few days complaining about the roads. Come to Chicago. The city of Chicago has to pay out millions of dollars a year in compensation to drivers whose cars are damaged by the potholes. It's remarkable the crumbling infrastructure in the United States. Total lack of investment in modern transport infrastructure that can facilitate trade and economic activity is quite remarkable. And there are now a lot of studies and a lot of predictions that show that over time, over 20, 30 years, that this is going to have a very heavy cost for the country, and will put in question whether the United States can maintain this global hegemony. I want to say something about the election, because I get asked all the time, who's going to be better, McCain, Hillary Clinton, or Barack Obama? And I already said that so I gave you a sense of the debate we've had on foreign policy, and I want to focus a bit more now on the debate that has gone on about U.S. policy towards Israel and Palestine, because that debate actually has happened. It hasn't happened in public, but it is happening within the U.S. establishment and within the think tanks and the universities and the whole foreign policy apparatus. And what we've come to see is, usually you think of a candidate gets advisors or gets people around them to help them make a policy. We're going to study the situation, we're going to see what the best thing is, and then we're going to follow that policy. That's how it should work, and that's how we all maybe want it to work. What we've seen, actually, is it's the ideology and the interests that produce the advisors. The advisors are chosen not because they'll give you good advice or because they have expertise in a certain area, independent expertise, but because they hold a certain view. And this has been particularly blatant in the case of Barack Obama, because there I can say I knew Barack Obama before anyone else did in this room. He was my local state senator more than 10 years ago, and we knew him. I mean, he used to come to the Palestinian and Arab American community centers that were in the south side of Chicago. He would come for events. We would sit with him and talk to him, and he was very open-minded on all the questions that are of concern to people in this region. He had advisors who were also open-minded. And what we've seen throughout the campaign is this consistent process of pushing away, of firing all the advisors who are giving more sensible advice and hiring advisors who simply give the advice, whatever you do, make sure you support Israel 100%. And this is to demonstrate, it's sort of like you put the actor on stage and you put people around him who speak certain lines. And it's been very depressing because it has also showed up another, I think, fallacy. Many people say, many Arab Americans say, you know, our problem is that we don't participate, we don't vote, we don't have, we don't go after the candidates and we don't educate them. I think this is one case, and there are others that demonstrate that that's not really the whole explanation. Because certainly Barack Obama was someone who was very well educated on these issues, who had advisors who were among the best known professors of Middle East studies in the United States, and who certainly understood the reality of what was going on. And yet it's made absolutely no difference in the election campaign, where every day he comes out with a new set of statements to show that he will not challenge Israel on anything. And so people say then, yeah, but he's just saying that now, and once he's elected, he'll do the right thing. And I'll say, well, when was there any president who promised to promised to support Israel and then didn't? Or promised to be, usually it's the other way, if they promise to be a little bit more even-handed and objective towards Arab causes, then once they get in office, they do the opposite. So the question is whether the election makes any difference at all. And the depressing conclusion is that it may not. And the reason I say that is, you'll recall in 2000, a large segment, not a majority, but a significant segment of the Arab American and Muslim American communities were very pro-Bush. And they thought that George Bush would be the one who would break with the kinds of policies that we see being reaffirmed today. And of course, you know that history. What I predict for the 2008 election is that it will be, in a way, to some extent, the election about Islam. It will be the election about who can be tougher on Muslims. And we already see that happening in the primaries. If you just listen to what's going on below the surface. And again, that's where Barack Obama is very instructive, because as many of you know, his father was Muslim, and many of his family were Muslim. When he was, according to the Los Angeles Times, that sent a reporter to Jakarta and to his school, and they found the register where in Indonesia, like in some other countries, the religion of the child is registered, he was registered in the school as a 5-year-old as a Muslim. That was what the LA Times found. So as a 5-year-old, he was as Muslim as any other 5-year-old as a Muslim or as a Christian or as a Jew or anything else, to the extent that any 5-year-old understands what religion is or what it means. I don't care. I don't think it makes a difference. It won't make him a better or worse president. The interesting thing was the reaction to that. His reaction was to deny it completely, to simply say it's not true. The other thing he said now constantly, as he's you can see these things on the internet, it's not hard to find it, that there are elaborate web pages and articles devoted to proving he's a Muslim. His reaction to that is, I am not and have never been a Muslim. I'm a Christian, and he said this, I'm quoting him, and I believe in the redemptive power of the blood of Jesus Christ. That's absolutely fine. The problem with it for me is I don't think people would be so happy with it or so accepting if he were accused of being a Jew and he reacted that way. And just imagine it, that a candidate, they say, your father was a Jew, you must be a Jew. No, I'm not a Jew, I've never been a Jew, I'm a Christian. But you were registered as a Jew. I'm not a Jew, I'm not a Jew, I'm not, I mean, this is the reaction he's had. And not at one point has he stood up and said, not at one point has he stood up and said that, you know, the reason these accusations are being made is not because people don't like Barack Obama, it's because they don't like Muslims. And you can prey on that fear. And neither have any of the other candidates condemned this kind of politics. Not Hillary Clinton, not John McCain, nor any of the others. You take the example of Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney was one of the Republican candidates who dropped out of the primary. He is a Mormon. This is a religion that was founded in the United States. It describes itself as a branch of Christianity. But there are millions of Mormons. It's a very successful religion. But there are many Christians who don't accept Mormons as true Christians, and they argue about that. Doesn't interest me at all. It's not, I don't have a view on it. I think everyone should have their religion and be respected. And that was the message of what, so there was this whole national debate for about 3 days, which is an eternity in the United States, to discuss any issue for that long, about how it's okay to be a Mormon. And everyone came out, all the candidates came out and said, of course, we would never discriminate against Mitt Romney for being a Mormon, and we love Mormons, and how great this is. And what it did was it helped Americans reaffirm how tolerant they are, and how, how we really do respect all religions. But there has been absolute silence on the issue of the incitement against Muslims. In the Republican debate, when I can't remember the exact date, it was in January, every single one of the Republican candidates said the greatest threat facing America is radical Islam. It wasn't reported, because very few people actually watch these debates, and then when they learn about it from the news, which quotes sound bites, very few people actually watch the whole thing or read the transcript. So it wasn't widely reported that every candidate agreed that what they called radical Islam or militant Islam is the great threat. But my prediction is that that is how the Republicans will play the 2008 election, that they will make this one of the key issues. And my prediction is the Democrats will not stand up to them. They will compete by showing, no, we can be just as tough on Muslims as you Republicans. And that, I think, is what's in store for us. Does that mean the situation is completely hopeless? I want to end with something a little bit more upbeat, because that could leave us very depressed. I think that it's clear that things are changing in this region, and that there has been a system in place for decades that is now under stress, if not collapsing. And that collapse doesn't necessarily take place from one day to the next, but it might take 10, 20, 30 years. We don't really know what the future will look like. It seems to me that one of the most unproductive things we could do is to fall into this trap of believing that the kind of civilizational war or sectarian conflict that is being promoted now, it's being actively promoted, is inevitable. I don't think it's inevitable. I think that we can make a choice to have something different. And there are examples in the world where that has happened, for example, in Northern Ireland. The second thing is to start to put forward alternative visions. Right now, the big fear, the big bogeyman is Islam and political Islam. Something much more powerful, there's something much more powerful in the world than political Islam, and that's political Christianity. You never hear it called that. Even the terms that are used to disguise it, and I'm not talking about anything in this region, I'm talking about what's happening in the United States. We have what should be called radical Christians, who are in many ways driving large parts of US public opinion. It's not something that should be considered a threat any more than Islam, in the sense that, well, I'd put it this way, I would say the radical Christian movements are more powerful and more radical than, say, the equivalent political Islamist movements. They do want to change the Constitution of the United States so that it becomes a Christian state. They do want to impose a way of life on all Americans that fits their definition of what it means to be a Christian. They do not represent all Americans, and they do not represent all Christians. But they are powerful. What it means is that the question of the role of religion in public life and the boundaries between citizenship and religion, between the state and organized religion, is a debate that has to happen everywhere. And that's something that we have to take part in and advocate. And it has to happen here, but not on terms set by US politicians running for election, but on our own terms. Let me stop with that and invite you to join the discussion. I've been a little bit all over the map because there's a lot I wanted to share, but don't hesitate to point the discussion onto the issues that you're most interested in.
Before we start the questions, I just wanted to say that you notice this lecture is being taped, so if you have any friends who would like to listen to it, you can go to the CASAR website, and it will be linked onto YouTube as well. And please use the microphone for questions. Okay, is that
I'm sorry to disagree with you on Obama and what you were saying, because I know from what I have been reading in the American newspapers that his foreign policy, if he becomes president, is completely different from McCain. McCain is a militaristic man who wants to invade Iran, who wants to bomb, who wants to continue the Bush administration policy. Obama is not that way. His character is not made that way. Now, the fact that you are talking he was pro-Palestinian, he changed, I can understand that within the American context of not winning if you start giving your opinions, and you said why there is, a bias against Islam, a bias against the Arab, etc. And the proof of that is his preacher right when he said that the Americans are pro-Israeli and are not helping the Palestinians. The uproar that took place following that, and the fact that Obama had to distance himself from that. So I don't agree, with you on that. As to the major thing that Bush did, and you were considering his era, I think for foreigners, for those who are outside of the U.S., is the loss of credibility of the U.S. This is the major thing, because after Bush, we don't believe anymore whether the president would be telling the truth or whether it's lies concerning mass destruction and how they invaded Iraq, the fact that that the U.S. did not in the past lie about invading a country. There in Iraq there was, the threat that there was weapons of mass destruction, that Blair used to say 45 minutes they were bombing Europe. So it is a blatant lie, and I think it lost its credibility, that people don't believe that.
Let me just say something. I mean, we don't know if Obama will be different. I think the thing I would caution against, and I perhaps should have said more about this, is that the president doesn't make foreign policy by himself. The president is sitting on top of a bureaucracy, a federal bureaucracy of 2 million people, and all policy in the United States is the result of the competition among interest groups who push their agendas on the government through various different means. What I can say is that Obama has said that he supports Bush's policy when it comes to Israel. He has said that he is ready to use force against Iran. He has said that he's ready to bomb Pakistan without permission from the Pakistani government. Yes, he said all of that. Well, that is the problem for many voters, is that, they are making a decision based on an impression from a very superficial discussion in the media. Many people believe like you do and want to believe that Obama will be different. All I can tell you is what he's said and what he's done. And I'm not convinced it's very different, but I hope I'm wrong. What I do think also is that the Bush era, I don't want to pin it on Bush by himself, but the Bush era has moved the goalposts, has moved the whole discussion very far to the right, so that there are things now that no president is going to challenge. It will take a very courageous president to abolish the military tribunals that are being used against people in Guantanamo. And I don't know if Obama would do that. If he would, that would be an impressive first step. So obvious things now have become controversial. It would all take a courageous president to stand up against torture. They're calling John McCain a maverick because he's against torture.
I have two comments, and maybe they include questions. First of all, it seems from what I've been hearing, and also from I just finished reading the Israel lobby. It seems that pragmatism in the world is creating terrorism everywhere. I mean, it's no longer a dialogue or policy, it's just terrorism. Because it seems to me that the attitude that the U.S. is taking towards Islam is almost totally instigated by Israel and by pragmatism, because somebody like Obama, who knows the way things are, for pragmatic reasons, as he said, he is siding with this very antagonistic totally antagonistic, not open even for discussion towards Islam. But anyway, I don't want to dwell too much on this. What I'm really concerned about is us. I mean, we in the picture, we the Arab world. You said each one is, I mean, so many so-called countries that are democratic are going to, the son is inheriting from the father, etc. I mean, you think, why do the people accept this? And the first thing that comes to my mind is very pessimistic, really, is that the way the West is attacking and trying to put the Islam and the Arabs in a very bad way, portray us in a very bad way, is affecting us. I mean, the Jews they suffered this kind of persecution, but maybe because they thought they were God's chosen people, they could combat that. But we don't even have that, resource. And it seems to me from my students nowadays, they are so much more pessimistic about their own power to change things or to have any kind of impact, much more than we were at their age. So, I mean, I don't know if you have any comment on this, about why we accept this, and are we really as demoralized as it seems to me, psychologically?
I think there's an important, I'm going to answer your question, but not in a direct way, because the impression we have, or what we're made to believe, is that the policies of the United States are a result of the negative views of Arabs and Muslims and the negative stereotypes of Arabs and Muslims. And that if we could change the stereotypes or change the views, then the policy would change. But I think that to a large extent, the stereotypes are the result of the policy, in the sense that the United States has the belief that it has to control this region for whatever reason. And that makes it necessary to have the stereotypes. And this is common. This is common. When the United States was engaged in the Cold War, there were very negative images of Russians. The United States had very negative images of Russians. In World War II, Japanese people were demonized. Now Americans have a very positive view of Japanese people. You saw in any time there is an imbalance of power, the strong need to justify their power. And typically how they do it is by saying, well, we're entitled to this power because those who don't have power don't deserve to have it, because they're less than us, they're less civilized than us, their religion is violent, if they got power, they would slaughter everyone. This is exactly the ideology that was used to justify apartheid in South Africa. When whites had a monopoly on power, they taught their children that blacks were wild savages. The West and the United States have power, and so they justify the power by saying, well, these people are not ready to hold power. They have to be civilized, they have to be democratized, they have to be liberated, which is usually, as we've seen in Iraq, a very, very brutal affair. And what we've also seen is that when the power is challenged and the power changes, the stereotypes change. So whites in South Africa don't demonize black people anymore. Whites in America, they used to justify apartheid and segregation in the South by saying that if we give up our power, our way of life will be destroyed. If we give black citizens the vote, they don't know how to, they'll vote for, crazy things. So we have to have this power. We're the custodians of what's good and right in the world. When there was a civil rights movement that challenged their power, that rhetoric went away. So the message of that is that we do have to build movements in this part of the world that represent people. It's not enough just to challenge the stereotypes. And where there are movements already, whether we like them or not, you don't have to like Hamas or Hezbollah or the other movements. All you have to do is recognize that they represent a significant portion of the population, and have captured the imagination of millions of people beyond the countries that they're in. And simply to demonize them and say they're terrorists and they're wild-eyed radicals and they want to destroy our way of life is not an answer. And it's not a way to get out of the struggle we're in. So one of the most effective things that, and I say we because I live in both worlds, I identify with this part of the world where I come from before going to America, which is that it's up to us to say that there are movements in this part of the world that are concerned with social justice, that are concerned with ending occupation, that are concerned with giving people dignity, that are concerned with giving people all the things that they lack. And you don't have to like them, but you have to recognize that they exist and talk to them. It's not possible that the one demand of all the people in the region is we have to recognize Israel. The one demand that's made, and they say, how can Israel talk to people who don't recognize them? Does Israel recognize anybody? So that, I think, is what has to change, is to recognize where there is movement in the region. And I'm not saying that your students who feel demoralized should go out and join Hamas or Hezbollah or any other party. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that it is to open all our eyes to the fact that there is fundamental change in the region. And those who are in charge of the current system want to prevent that change and are afraid of it, and for understandable reasons, because it threatens them. And if we want the change to go in a different direction from where we see it going, we have to engage in it, to start putting forward our own visions and our own discussions of where we want to, what do your students want to see for themselves in the future? What kind of a world, what kind of a Lebanon, what kind of a Middle East do they want to live in? And not simply to follow the path that is set for them. We're given two choices. You're either with the good guys or the bad guys, or with us or against us. And it was at AUB, when my father was here, that people had all that hope that they would change the region and change the world and make it into something different. And a lot of people were disappointed about how it turned out, but I don't want to sound like Barack Obama, but we have to recapture some of that hope.
Thank you especially for your personal insight on Barack Obama from 10 years ago compared to now, and how he's changed. I thought that was very useful. On the other hand, I don't think it's that awful useful to expect any candidate to declare any kind of independence from Israel when nobody could. I mean, Ralph Nader never did, as far as I can tell.
No, he has. He has.
He has. Well, that's good news. But never. And relating also to the question of Obama's relationship to Islam, he would not be the one to say, hey, let's lay off Islam. It would be up to Hillary Clinton and McCain to do that. But that's not really my interest. Given the fact that all of the candidates are so foursquare with Israel, one of the things that some of us fear is that as a result of bad conscience, in other words, we can't really do anything against Israel, but hey, here's what we can do. Let's cozy up to somebody like Syria, and let's do it by letting Syria get back into Lebanon and keep Lebanon as a toy. In that way, we've proven our bona fides with the progressive forces in the world, and we've stayed chummy with Israel. And I was wondering if you have any point of view on that particular scenario, because that's when I talk to people here in Lebanon, that's what people fear about Obama more than anything, is a kind of knowing that he won't touch Israel, that he will then do something to placate so-called progressive forces.
So-called realpolitik reasons why the U.S. might do that one day as it had in the past. But I don't think that's related to progressive forces necessarily. The point that is being made time and again, and many of us make it, is we assume that the Israel lobby has a veto on who is elected. And actually, and we assume that because also we say, well, look at Barack Obama, look how he's changed. That provides further proof that the Israel lobby is in control. Actually, I think what's happened with Barack Obama shows something different, and shows the possibility of something different. And here's why. Because Obama is perceived as being the candidate, whether it's fair or unfair, he's perceived as being the candidate least favorable to Israel. He's the candidate about whom many pro-Israel organization leaders have the most questions. They have the most doubts about him. And yet he's winning. So what that suggests to me is if he does win the nomination, even if he doesn't go on to win the election, that the candidate least favorable to the Israel lobby won. And right now he's ahead. So so that suggests a possibility that actually there is scope for some change. Now Barack Obama is, I don't know why he feels, he may have calculated that this is a close election, I don't want to take any risks. Or even if he could win the Democratic primary without taking those positions, he couldn't win the general election. I don't know. But it suggests that the Israel lobby is not all-powerful as we think it is. The other element of that is someone mentioned, or maybe I mentioned, but I think someone else did, the book on the Israel lobby by Walton Mearsheimer. And that book, it's an interesting book. I wouldn't say they answer all the questions satisfactorily, but it has started a debate, and or in a way it's the product of a debate where people are starting to question the value of this relationship with Israel, because apartheid South Africa had a value to the United States. There was a reason the United States supported apartheid South Africa. It was because of the Cold War, and South Africa helped with all these different things in Mozambique and Angola against the Cubans and everything. And part of the collapse of apartheid South Africa was the end of the Cold War. The U.S. no longer needed apartheid South Africa, so they let it collapse, in addition to the sanctions and the opposition and resistance and so on. With Israel, there was that Cold War justification, and U.S. support for Israel really only took off after 1967. And after the end of the Cold War, Israel also lost its reason for being a U.S. client. And we began to see the United States starting to put a bit of pressure on Israel. Not much, but a bit. And September 11th provided the perfect opportunity for Israel to reinvent itself, rebrand itself as the ally in the war on civilizations. That we are your outpost in this region. And it's a set of arguments that guarantees that Israel will never be accepted in the region. Because if Israel's whole marketing brand is we are the civilized, rational, democratic West among the sea of barbarians, there's no possible basis for acceptance or coexistence with such a state. But it does provide an ideological framework for continued flows of weapons and money and diplomatic support, that I don't yet see, the next president challenging significantly. But if the U.S. turns away from the war of civilizations ideology, then Israel and the whole relationship does come into question. And people like Walter Mearsheimer are saying, they're saying, well, what disputes do we have with Iran that we can't sit down with them and resolve? So when people like that start to say it, it suggests a glacial shift in thinking, but one that's happening.
Thank you. Thank you for shedding some light on the political Christianity and making the comparison with, specifically on radical Christians in the West or in the U.S. and making the comparison with their equivalent in other parts of the world. There's always one question, at least in my case, I do get that question when I'm in a discussion that really frustrates and distorts the discussion. So I'm going to ask you that question in part I'm curious to know how you would respond to it about this topic. And that is, in this comparison that you made, and as superficial a question as you can get, you don't see Christian radicals blowing themselves up. That's the type of question that I feel frustrates the debate. So I'm going to ask you this question, but more interestingly, as a subset or a sub-question, what are the implications of the civilians using their bodies or using themselves as suicide bombers, and knowing that at the same time the media in the West and perhaps in this part of the world doesn't really focus on any sort of nonviolent resistance by civil society, let's say in Palestine or in other parts of the world. Thank you.
Yes, that's a good question, one I get all the time as well. Well, one is that, political Christianity in the United States controls the state, so they don't need to blow themselves up. I mean, can exercise its violence through the state. So they have the military to blow people up for them. They don't have to blow themselves up. So the other thing is that there is an effort to paint. I'm not here to say any discussion of this, you're always accused of justifying terrorism. Well, there was a study, there's been a couple now, but there was one particularly important study by Robert Pape at the University of Chicago, who studied suicide bombings all over the world, 500 or 600 bombings, and found that they had, just listing them and looking at them quantitatively, that they had nothing to do with religion, that they were generally to do with resistance movements opposing military occupation from outside. And it's notable that in Palestine, the first ever suicide bombing was in 1994, 100 years into the Zionist colonization of Palestine. It took 100 years before somebody blew themselves up. In Iraq, the first suicide bombing was after the U.S. occupation. So even in those two cases, we see that relationship holding. And these are weapons of the weak. People use their bodies because they don't have cruise missiles. I don't think that there's any religion in the world where people have some kind of inherent desire to blow themselves up or to see their children do that or to give up their own lives. I think this is a product of the kind of struggle that has been imposed on people, and we've also seen that we've also seen particularly Hamas, for example, basically abandoned the strategy as of 2004. There have been a couple of suicide bombings since then, but as a policy, they abandoned it. So these are political decisions. They may not be ones we agree with, they may be ones we oppose very strongly, but it's a mistake to attribute them to a religion. The other thing is that every fighting force has the sort of the rhetoric and the language of martyrdom. It's somehow considered more troubling amongst resistance movements. But, you know, the whole rhetoric of sacrifice of the U.S. military is a rhetoric of martyrdom, that we are sacrificing for your freedom. We are, you know, we are giving up all this. All these people are dying. They don't call them martyrs in the United States, but the rhetoric and the ideology around it is similar. So, again, I'm just trying to highlight where, just by using different language, you can make similar things seem somehow unrelated.
I have two, what I hope to be quick questions. My first one was, you were discussing the unofficial name of the war on terror in the States, the clash of civilizations. And I wanted to touch on that because there's this general emergence of popularity for radical parties, or what you can label radical parties in the Middle East, Hamas in Palestine, and Hezbollah here, and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and whatnot. But and in the Western media, the mainstream Western media, what they've done successfully, I would say, is that they've been able to say that that these radical parties have been able to push for civil service and anti-corruption laws, and they've been able to work with the society, and that's what gets them to be so popular. I remember reading in 2006 that Hamas won basically because they were against Fatah's corrupt laws, and here in Lebanon, Hezbollah have jihad al-bana, they fix your windows and your roads. So doesn't that, right there, and it's in the U.S. media, the mainstream media, doesn't that prove that the clash of civilizations is somewhat an absurd theory, and that there is, there's not ideological but socio-economic reasons as to why radical Islam has emerged? And my second question, and please correct me if I'm wrong, didn't you write an article on Electronic Intifada where you endorsed Barack Obama basically because you had a conversation with him or something, and he told you that to keep the struggle on or something? I remember reading one of your articles where he told you specifically in 2007 or 2006 to keep the movement on or something. Correct me if I'm wrong, please.
I did write an article. I didn't endorse him. I'd say go back and read the article more carefully. And we just published another one on that, and on the whole Jeremiah Wright controversy, where I argue that a lot of the targeting of his pastor Jeremiah Wright actually had to do with Wright's views on Israel, not so much his views on race in America. But again, I'll let you read that one. The question of these movements responding to popular needs, well, when Hezbollah or Hamas or any other party provides services to people because they need them, the way it's reported in the United States is, oh, they're trying to bribe people into supporting them. When the United States tries to bribe people into supporting them, it's called development.
Hi, I just have a couple of points or questions that I'd like to raise. I thought it was interesting earlier on in your talk, where you were talking about how in a number of Middle Eastern regimes it seems as though it's kind of a de facto sovereign type situation where you get leadership being passed from father to son and so on, and I've certainly noticed that. We've just come from Syria where Bashar al-Assad is now in charge. I suppose the point that I would like to make is that that's something that's not necessarily unique to Middle Eastern societies. If we look at even the US, for example, you can look at the Bushes and also the Clintons. So it seems to me that regardless of whether it's a democracy or some other type of situation, it seems to me that there's often a ruling elite, if you like, in a lot of parts of the world. So that's one point I'd like to make. And the second point I'd like to make, and I'd like your comment on it too, is that I'm a visitor from Australia, and I've been in the region for the last couple of weeks and just reading some of the local media. And I suppose that the difference that I've noticed is that coming from Australia, I guess we get the attitude of the media, the mainstream media in Australia is similar to what you have in the US, where I suppose to an extent the Muslims are painted as the bad guys in the Middle East sort of confrontation. But certainly from reading the local papers here in Lebanon, it's very much the other way, where Israel are painted as the bad guys. A point that I've read a couple of times in the media is some of the media are saying that it's actually in Israel's interest to prolong, if you like, the conflict with the Palestinians. The example that was used in the past couple of days was the recent bulldozing of a couple of Palestinian homes in occupied territories. And the point that some of the media were making was that Israel seemed to be have an agenda whereby they like to provoke the Palestinians and provoke Muslims in order to prolong the conflict. And I could kind of see that, but then my question is, well, why is it in Israel's interest to do that? Why is it in Israel's interest not to reach a peaceful settlement? And I'd just like your thoughts on that.
I'll try to do that quickly. One is that Israel is certainly the country that can't take yes for an answer, and the country that never misses an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And we've seen since 2002, every year, the Arab Summit, all the Arab leaders unanimously beg Israel to accept their peace offer, and Israel is uninterested in it. And the basic reality, what Israel is interested in, is maintaining power. For Israel is a sectarian state. It's a state which has a government representing half the population of the territory it controls, which is the Jewish population. There's roughly 12 million people in Israel-Palestine, and only half of them are Jews. And there's one government that controls that territory. We have, the Palestinians are unique in the world because they don't have a state, but they have two prime ministers. They have more prime ministers per capita than any other people, and plus a president. Lebanon, on the other hand, doesn't have a president, but that's another matter I won't go into now. But there is only one government that controls whether people in Gaza eat, whether they have electricity, whether they live or die, whether they can travel or move around, and it's the Jewish sectarian government. And it's not unique in the world. There were other such governments. There was a Protestant sectarian government in Northern Ireland, and the Catholic population rebelled against it. And there's peace now because it was replaced with a government of all its citizens, which represents people and gives them equal rights, regardless of whether they're Protestant or Catholic. South Africa had a white sectarian government. Once that was replaced with a democratic government, there could be peace. But what that involves always is that those who have the monopoly of power have to give something up. They have to give up their special and better rights. They have to give up their monopoly on resources, on jobs, on land, on water, on all those things. And generally speaking, people who have those things don't like to give them up. They never do it voluntarily. I mean, in the United States, whites did not wake up one morning and say, my goodness, we've been so terrible, we should end slavery, or we should give black citizens the vote. They tried everything to prevent that, including setting dogs on peaceful demonstrators, blowing up churches, killing black schoolgirls. A lot of effort was put into preventing that transfer of power from those who have it to those who didn't. And so Israel is now in the most desperate phase of its attempt to maintain ill-gotten and illegitimate power. And the only possibility for peace is when Israel is willing to shed that power. And I think that that when that happens, there is a possibility of peace. But Israel's idea of peace is, we preserve everything we have as it is, and you accept it. And that's not a peace that works anywhere in the world. We have... I'm not tired, but other people are getting tired, so we should stop maybe a couple more, and I'll try to be quick in my answers, so we'll get as many in as we can.
Everybody is talking only about occupation, and they say just occupation. What we are saying is much more than occupation. It's storing the land, killing people and throwing them out their land, and storing it. That's much more than occupation.
Yeah, I agree completely. I want to just quickly say that one of the mistakes that we have made politically and intellectually in this region is to reduce the issue to occupation. The occupation, and let's talk about Palestine in particular, the occupation is only 1/3 of the problem. Because supposing tomorrow Israel leaves the West Bank and Gaza Strip completely, it doesn't solve the problem. Because within its borders, Israel is still a racist state. You still have more than 1 million Palestinians who don't have equal rights. So, you know, we can have a two-state solution, but both have to be democratic states, not one Palestinian state and one Jewish state that has the right to be racist against its non-Jewish citizens. So, the racist nature of Israel has to be challenged, and the Palestinians inside Israel are challenging it. You know that they have put forward very strong demands for Israel to become a state of all its citizens, a democracy, and they have received no support from the United States, no support from Europe, no support from the Arab states, and no support even from the rest of the Palestinian people. And they're losing their land, and Israel just announced a plan to destroy 500 houses in Jaffa. So what's happening to Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza is still happening to Palestinians in Israel. And then, of course, the third group of Palestinians are the refugees. How does a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza restore the rights of refugees? It doesn't. So, again, refugees are being excluded on a purely racist basis. The only reason that they're not allowed back to their homes is because they're the wrong kind of human being. Whereas a Jew can come from Argentina or wherever, or the Amazon. So again, it's a point of making the case that the issue is not occupation, it's injustice and a racist system. And that has to be challenged on all the fronts. The occupation within Israel and against refugees.
Okay, the last question.
I have a question about the work that would have to be done in the various populations affected in order to make peace possible. You've talked a lot about policies and the brave steps that we all hope that politicians in the various countries, whether it be the U.S. or Israel or the Palestinian territories or here, you know, would make to make a big change possible. But I'm wondering, given how incredibly entrenched public opinion and a certain attitude has become in all the places I just mentioned, and how much misinformation has been spread, particularly over the last couple years and going back a long time, what it would take beyond a politician making a speech and saying something different to make it possible that we could see peace, at least in our lifetimes.
I think that you know, when I talk about and many people talk about resistance, there's a danger that it's portrayed only as armed resistance and violence, and that's not what I'm talking about. I think there has to be resistance in the form of putting forward alternative visions. I think it's a big mistake that Palestinians, for example, haven't offered a convincing alternative to the vision of a racist Israeli state that the rest of the world is supporting. So, you know, we have not, Palestinians have not, and the rest of the world has not grappled with the question of, okay, if you abolish all the racist laws and practices in Israel, then you're going to have a state that represents everyone. What does that look like? What does that look like in Lebanon? You know, what does it look like in the rest of the region, where we have people being cut and sliced into different sects and different groups? So part of it is to develop alternatives, to say, you know, we've been offered choices that are not made in Lebanon or not made in Palestine. All the choices are made outside. What is it what are the visions that can emerge? And that has to happen through, you know, it's not something that can be done with a political speech. It has to be done through all kinds of engagement, all kinds of discussion, all kinds of activity. It can't be done with just waving flags and putting up pictures of this or that leader. There has to be a real debate and discussion about what our societies will look like. And the other thing is that there has to be action to level the playing field. When it comes to Palestine, there is a growing. People say we don't want violence. I don't want violence. I think that the bloodshed that has happened in this region, in Lebanon, in Palestine, in Iraq, is a catastrophe for years and generations to come. What's the alternative then? If we see regimes that are abusing the rights of people in this way, there has to be other forms of resistance. And we saw that with apartheid South Africa, civil resistance, international solidarity in the form of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, to impose a cost on those in power, because it's only when they feel squeezed that they start to talk. They don't talk to people whose strength they don't recognize. And so we have to think about ways to build up strength for those who are demanding justice. Those who are happy with injustice have a lot of strength. How can those who want to see a more just society build up their strength? And that's the challenge.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.